Good evening. This is Jackie Newbrough, and we want to welcome all of our friends from Why Liberty Matters and from Kingdom Liberty who are joining us. Tonight, Dr. Marlene is going to share with us, can Alinsky's methods be used righteously? So take it away, Dr. Marlene.
Okay, well, thank you and blessings to all. Now, I know we often say, you're never going to hear the news the same. You're going to see the world differently after you understand this. But whether you already have a pretty good idea who Alinsky is, or you've never heard of him before, you're going to have a new understanding of how our culture has changed and what you can do, first of all, in your own understanding, and then in your personal sphere of influence, to be able to further liberty instead of tyranny. Now, all of us in this group, we want to further liberty. We would never set out purposely to do anything to derail that. But what we find happening is because we don't know and because we haven't been taught to think from principle, because we've been conditioned to be relativist instead of thinking from fixed points of reference that never move, then we are easy prey to the person who's the best at the use of language, the best at the use of the methods of group manipulation. The social engineers are able to move whole churches and communities and denominations because the people in the leadership don't even realize what the scriptures say about a lot of these very practical areas. Because what we talk about here is how the Bible applies, or what the Bible says about law, government, history, economics, and education. We talk about liberty, language, and culture. And as you learn these things and you learn the principles of liberty, you'll start to see the world clear up. It's like the lens gets clearer. The whole setting, on the dial, like if you could tune in a lens and make it focused, the focus improves. So whether you have heard of Alinsky or not, his ideas have greatly influenced the world we live in. He established his goals, wrote them out, taught them to people of influence so that his ideas would live long after his death in 1972. And you look at that and you see how the ideas that live long, if you want ideas to live past your lifetime, I'm giving you clues right here in front of you. Now, this is explaining one of Alinsky's goals in life. Alinsky, the father of community organizing, and we'll talk more about what does that mean. You'll understand the meaning of that more as we go through this. He dreamed of socialism one day replacing the, in Alinsky's words, jungle of American capitalism. And he wrote that he hoped for a future where the means of production will be owned by all of the people instead of just a comparative handful. Now, of course, in communism, the means of production are owned by the government. And so if you look at that, if the means of production are owned by a few, then that becomes, in essence, it's still a redistributive society. It's not a free society. Because if they're owned supposedly by the hands of a few, that still is an elitist situation. If they're means of production are supposedly owned by the people, the problem is the government can't give these means of production to the people. The people have to obtain them for themselves. So even his statement is flawed, but you have to understand enough about economics to decipher that. That's not the most important thing that we're going to talk about, but I wanted you to see that here at the beginning, because now many articles that are written about Alinsky try to tell you that he was not a socialist. And I even have some of the ways that's done here later on in this teaching. Now, not only has redistribution of wealth become the new normal, but so has the thinking that leads to bondage and tyranny. In other words, Alinsky's ideas that were considered radical when he was writing have now been so infiltrated and mainstreamed in our society that we actually have an avowed socialist running for president. We've had people that hold to redistributive views running for president for years and years and years. And even before FDR, we had people running for president who really held to those views, but they weren't able to use the terms or explain it openly because they were considered too radical. Now, Alinsky was a student of archaeology and thus history. He did not create the fundamental concepts of community organization. Now, sometimes you'll read an article and it basically says that Alinsky created these things. And my premise is, no, he didn't create them. He just put them in modern terminology. So he identified, codified, means he wrote them down, and he put them in modern terms. So this is what he did. So he took these ideas and he put in modern terms what every power monger and tyrant throughout history has known: how to persuade the masses to follow him. If you read about the Caesars, you read about any of the leaders of history, religious leaders or political leaders, they all knew certain things that the masses did not know. All Alinsky did was brought those up to modern terms and adapted the tactics so that the people who wanted more power would be able to use them. Now, Saul Alinsky was born in Chicago in 1909 to Russian Jewish parents. He was friends with Al Capone and his mobsters. Alinsky was drawn to power and wanted to have it for himself and help others, especially the underdogs, to get more for themselves. In other words, to get more power. So he's fascinated with power. So he was fascinated with John L. Lewis, the great labor leader, and with the hard-headed tactics used by unions. His work developed into what is known today as the Alinsky concepts of mass organization for, what's that next word? Power. So remember, when you see women dressing with it, showing their arms, when you see what's the symbols of power, the arm raised with a fist showing and with a tool, especially a maul or some kind of a hammer or a tool in the hand. And all this stuff with the women showing their arms and the idea of that's a hidden, like kind of understated statement of power. And it's part of the power culture versus where we used to think of wanting to highlight a woman's face, that she dressed, her clothes were made so that she wore a collar to highlight her face. She wore a scarf or jewelry to make people see her face first and then notice the rest of her body. And so whenever you change, however the people are taught to dress, shows a lot about what's important to their culture and why, where the focus is. So we are living in a transition period, or we're really pretty much through it, from going to where your countenance is to be what is shown, to where now it's all about power. In 1930, Alinsky organized the back of the yards area in Chicago and became known as a master organizer of the poor. In 1940, he established the Industrial Areas Foundation to organize communities throughout the United States. Now, this group is still in operation today, and it's had many, many, many offshoots, many imitators, and so these concepts are still alive and well. In 1946, Alinsky wrote Reveille for Radicals, his first major book about the principles and tactics of community organizing. He helped establish the dual tactics that characterize the 1960s that have remained central to all subsequent revolutionary movements in the United States. So what are these dual tactics? Confrontation, in other words, being in your face, hitting it head on, not doing it from behind the scenes. So that's the frontal assault. And then the other one is infiltration. In other words, you're infiltrating the organization. Now, you'll see later on that there was a conflict between his followers as to whether or not you had to actually be an insider. In other words, could you only influence change from within the ranks of an organization or from outside? But these are what's considered his dual tactics. Now, Reveille for Radicals is the book upon which Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis in 1969. That's from Wellesley. And you can go there and ask to see it, but you can only take a pencil in. You can't really take notes. You can take, a few handwritten notes. You can't make copies of it, and it's pretty much under lock and key. And during when the Clintons were in office before, they actually had it where you couldn't even see the thesis. It was under lock and key during that time. Now, this is Hillary Clinton speaking, and she says, I agreed with some of Alinsky's ideas. She explained in Living History, her 2003 biography, particularly the value of empowering people to help themselves. But we had a fundamental disagreement. He believed you could change the system only from the outside. I didn't. Now, what she's saying is she believed you could change the system more effectively from the inside than outside. And if you read a lot of these writings and these articles and really get into the quotes and kind of read what friends even said of the conversation with each other, and you get into hearing even if you watch 60 Minutes and heard Valerie Jarrett's interview about the Obamas, and talking about the term self-interest and how you'll hear that term from Alinsky. You'll also hear it from Ayn Rand. So you get into where do all these ideas come from and how do they make a difference. And it's why we say, the scriptures say, take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. Another way of putting that is be careful what ideas you allow to be planted in the garden of your mind. Be very, very careful. A seemingly insignificant little seed, you're not quite sure what it is, where it's going to go. It can become the biggest weed in the garden. So when you have a biblical foundation from which to think, you can keep your garden of your mind weeded a little more frequently than if you don't have the scriptures, because then you don't have an objective standard from which to judge truth from error. So the most reasonable ideas, the ones that have the greatest backing, can sound so wonderful. Okay, now this is from an MSNBC.com article from back in 2007, and it was written by Bill Dedman, and the title is Reading Hillary Rodham's Hidden Thesis. And that's where this quote came about whether she believed in changing it from the inside or the out. Now, in the same article that we just told you about, Hillary is quoted as referring to Alinsky's compelling personality and his exceptional charm. Now, I want you to remember that as we tell you more about him. And then you can decide whether you think he's charming or not. Be very careful when you wear a charm. Okay? So, in 1971, 25 years after its publishing, Alinsky expanded upon his original work and wrote Rules for Radicals, a pragmatic primer or primer for realistic radicals. Now, if you look at this, he's saying there's certain rules that apply all the time. He's saying he's only appealing to radicals. In other words, he's not talking to the mainstream. He's also telling you he's pragmatic. He's telling you it's a primer. In other words, this is just the starting place. He's again using the term realistic, meaning for people who want something that works. It's again an appeal to both pragmatism and to kind of the end justifies the means thinking, but to people who really want to change their world and they don't want to wait 3 generations to do it. And then again, he's used the term radicals twice, so he's again reminding you, I'm not talking to everybody. In fact, the title is made so that the people he does not want to know what he's talking about will not even care to look at the book. You pay attention to what I'm just telling you. The title itself isn't, you think of creating a title to sell as many books as possible. But in this case, the title was created so that the people he did not want to know his information would not even be interested. I more got that from understanding Bernays and his writing about propaganda and how these things work and understanding dialectic than him openly saying that. Now, this is the first actual how-to manual for aspiring Marxist revolutionaries in the United States. Now, before this, they had to get European literature, and then some of it was in English, but they had to get it translated if it was in other languages. But the main point here is this brought the ideas of Marxism that were rampant in Europe to the United States and put them in the hands of the average student, the average radical. Now, he dedicated the book to Lucifer. And this is a quote from the dedication of the book. Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical from all our legends, mythology, and history. And then in parentheses he says, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? That's the parentheses close. He goes on and says, the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. Now, you think about that, and there's other quotes where he basically says he wants to go to hell, that heaven would be miserable. He would enjoy hell more than heaven. Now, in a January 16th, 2012 Forbes article, I could not leave this out, folks, because you have to see this. Dear President Obama, you're no Saul Alinsky. That's the title of the article. Forbes magazine. Ralph Benko, B-E-N-K-O, is the author. And this is a quote from Benko. Rules for Radicals, popular lore aside, is not dedicated to Lucifer, but to Irene, Saul's wife and soulmate. Now, I want this logged for the record. I actually own a copy of this book, and the copy I have is dedicated to Lucifer. And you'll see it over and over and over again stated, even by secularists, sometimes praising him that his book's dedicated to Lucifer, and therefore they know he's a true soulmate. But when I was just so amazed that Forbes would have printed that without having somebody vet that article. And there were a few copies, there were a few editions that were printed without it, but the original one was printed with it, and I know I don't have an original, and it does have it in it. Now, known as the father of modern American radicalism, Alinsky developed strategies and tactics that take the enormous, unfocused, emotional energy of grassroots groups and transform it, that's that energy, okay, into effective anti-government, and anti-corporate activism. Some of these rules are ruthless, but they work. Now, this is from some of the quotes. Look at that. It's a quote from Crossroad, and it's about communism and Alinsky. Now, Alinsky's motto, the most effective means or whatever will achieve the desired results. Now, do you see, there's so much message right here in this. And one of the things I want you to pay attention to is that the words that we often gloss over are the words that give us the most information. So he's talking about means. So he's telling you a method. So means is another word for method. So he's saying the most effective methods are whatever. Oh, wow. Do you hear the term whatever? See, the brand that says whatever says that all worldviews are equal, that it doesn't matter what you do. All ideas, believe whatever you want to believe. It's up to you to decide what you want to believe. And what Alinsky's saying is that whatever works, and basically, whatever methodology you have to use to get to your desired results, those are good methods. Okay, excuse me. So, start to pay attention to the simple words, in quotes, not just the bigger things that most people pay attention to. Now, Alinsky believed sociopathology, and in other words, sociopaths, and criminality in all vices were caused by external societal influences. In other words, from the outside, rather than personal character flaws, and that by changing the structure of society's institutions, one could rid the world of such vices. Now, again, there's so much embedded in this quote, because he's talking about, in other words, people are changed by institutions. This is why the liberals, why the left is so into building institutions. It's partly of how they want to be remembered, because many of them don't believe in an afterlife, so they really believe that the only way they're going to be remembered is by building an institution or a building or something that people can look at. And I get the desire, part of our kingdom purpose is to pass on ideas. Part of my kingdom purpose is to pass the torch of liberty to the next generation. And so, but I'm investing in people's hearts and minds. I'm investing in their ideas. I'm not trying to build an institution per se. And so, but if you look at this, let's go back one. He says, basically, someone who's a sociopath or bent toward the criminal mind. And all vices are caused by external societal influences. So this is where you get the idea in community planning and in this whole Agenda 21 restructuring and changing the environment and moving the people out of the inner city. If you just move them out of the inner city and put them out in the suburbs, their desire to commit crime will go down. All of this thinking that says if you change the environment, it will change the person. You take the person and give them a new, instead of their old housing plan that is all beat up and dirty, build new housing for them, and somehow it will make them quit having any desire for criminal activity. It also, if you notice this quote, rather than personal character flaws. Now, if my personal character flaws, if there's no cause and effect between my character and my results, then I have no responsibility. I can blame it on somebody else. And that's what he's getting at. So if you look at today's whole culture, and you look at the mobs and the people throwing bricks in windows, and you look for them beating up each other, and then you hear the commentator or the the community leader person say, well, they have all this bent up tension and they just have to let it out. It's the fault of the culture that's made them do it. This is where this thinking comes from. So I don't want you to just think it just happened. Or sometimes you'll hear a more conservative commentator saying, I just don't understand. How would anybody think this way? Well, I'm showing you where these ideas come from. And, of course, behind Alinsky was reading a lot of this social psychology stuff, and he was reading the kind of things that later on Benjamin Bloom was reading, but early on he would have been reading what we would call the Frankfurt School, the Horkheimer, and all of that crew. These are the people that Alinsky read. And you always learn a lot when you look at what kind of materials people read. It's why when you study the Founding Fathers and you look at them reading Blackstone and you look at them reading Locke, and then you still have to look at where did these quotes come from? Well, a lot of these quotes are from the Bible. And then a lot of the quotes of the books, the people that they read came from the Bible. So my point is here, you can chase these ideas down if you just spend a little bit of time. Now, what my comment is about the recent slide is this idea of, in other words, change from the outside to the inside. This is obviously based in evolution. In other words, this is not the view of someone who believes in a creator, and removes the sin factor. Remember, their vice is the result of their circumstances, not they don't have any personal responsibility. It removes cause and effect. In other words, we just don't know how this happened, or if it did, it's not a personal responsibility. The cause and effect is from the outside in instead of from the inside out. But the scriptures tell you that the heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked, who can know it? And he tells you to guard the heart, as out of it flow the issues of life. It tells you over and over and over again, the internal is causative of the external. So biblically, cause to effect is internal to external. But in this case, it's a removal of a biblical cause to effect. Okay, so also it removes personal responsibility and the immutable laws of the universe from life. Now, I feel bad for anyone who grows up without being told the rules of life. I want to know what the rules are wherever I go. I want to know what's happening. And what we've done to today's culture, to this current generation especially, is we put them on the playing field, and instead of not giving them a manual, we've given them a manual with erroneous information, which is even worse than them having to at least get out and figure out what the rules of the game are themselves. Some of them are starting to figure out that the manual they've been given, mostly through the public education system, is not giving them accurate information. And now they're very vulnerable because they're looking other places for information. And so part of what I'm doing is developing a body of material that is put in a form that people can find it and use it, and it will apply to cultures and for generations to come. It's not just about now. Now, Alinsky said in Reveille for Radicals, remember that was his first book, when the masses demonstrate a capacity for brutality, selfishness, hate, greed, avarice, and disloyalty. Now, first of all, just look at that. What does that look like to you? Okay, think about a summary word that sums up all those things. So when the masses demonstrate a capacity for brutality, selfishness, hate, greed, avarice, and disloyalty, it is not the people who must be judged, but the circumstances that made them that way. In other words, if we didn't understand the other quote, maybe we will get this one. Now, look at this. That wasn't the first slide a summary of sin? So, but it's not our fault. We didn't do anything about it. It's my circumstances that made me do it. And so that is the operating premise under which all this community organization works. That's why they're constantly looking for somebody to blame, and that's why they can justify whether it's killing the police officer or taking a baseball bat and standing on a car and beating out all the windows, or threatening people, or stealing from them, and on the list can go, because, see, it was that person that made them do it. It's like saying that when you get angry, it's the fault that that person made you angry. Well, they didn't make you angry. They just showed up the anger that was in you. I know that's hard to get sometimes, but when we assume personal responsibility, then we can solve it, because otherwise you're dependent upon changing the other person, or that somehow getting that other person or that institution or that whoever to change. And then you go through life trying to beg somebody else to change. Where if it's your personal responsibility, then you can take responsibility for it and you can make the change. And you don't have to wait around for somebody else to do that. It's very liberating. Alinsky believes that chief among these circumstances were and this is the quote, the larcenous, that means theft, pressures of a materialistic society. Now, I understand that we're in a consumer-driven, debt-based society that says, buy me, buy me, buy more, buy me everywhere. But what he's getting at is that the external pressures of a materialistic society is at fault. Alinsky, while billed as an anti-communist, and he really was, and some of his literature would, he spoke against communism. But it's all a word game, folks, because he really was a redistributionist. So no matter whether you call it socialist or communist or Marxist or what words you used, he believed that it was right, it was just to take from the people who had the most and give to the people who had the least, never dealing with the moral problems of legalized plunder. And if you have any doubt about that, you need to read The Law by Bastiat. Well, first of all, you read the Ten Commandments, because one of them says thou shalt not steal and another says thou shalt not covet. That pretty well sums it all up. But if you want a little longer explanation, in the 86-page The Law by Bastiat, you can buy from us, or you can listen to it, or read it for free on the internet. The point is that Alinsky, see, there's all these word games that go on, and people who haven't read the book then are able to be derailed from understanding what the argument was about when a presidential candidate is using the methodology of Alinsky, and it kind of comes up, and then it's derailed because the people don't understand. So when you catch the thinking of Alinsky and his cronies, you will hear the language of a few people I think you've heard of: Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Paul Krugman. When you start hearing Alinsky and you get what he's saying about, well, you just can't blame the people. It's the fault of the rich guy. It's all the rich guy's fault. Therefore, it's okay to rail against the rich guy. Where do they get this? This is part of what's fed and fueled that whole narrative. Now, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals is the playbook of social engineering and community organization. And most of you have our social engineering handout, but if you don't, I don't know that we have a slide for it in this one, but you can always write to us at contact@whylibertymatters.com. That's contact@whylibertymatters.com, and it's a 4-page handout on social engineering. And you need to get that thing and read it over and over and over again. It's kind of written in sound bites, and every time you hear one of these teachings, you can go back and you'll find another nugget that makes more sense after you understand what's really going on. Rules for Radicals is a handbook of deceit. It's of group manipulation techniques, class warfare, and the ends justify the means. Once you accept that the ends justify the means, that's a summary of that is pragmatism, you have moved to the tactics of tyranny. no matter how much you talk about freedom. A lot of the promoters of especially vouchers and school choice, they have an ends justify the means idea. That's kind of their premise. So I explained to them that the immutable laws of the universe are being breached. And what do they come back and say? Wow, I never knew that before. Oh, I need to learn what these rules, what these immutable laws of the universe are. Wow, how did you find these principles of liberty? This is amazing. Why didn't anybody tell me this before? Instead, they come back and say, well, then there must be a way that we can work this out. There must be a way that we can do this. And I get that from Christian conservatives more than I get that from liberals. So you have to look at this, folks, and go, have we really become that relativistic in our churches that now we are promoting, we have promoted as a biblical position the idea of more dependency on the government, and that it's a biblical position to petition the government for more money and to take away the essential liberty of the few people who are still controlling the education of their own children? Because that's what vouchers and school choice will do, is it will remove the control from the parent, and just, even if the parent still homeschools in name only, they will still be an arm of the state. They'll just be doing it in their home instead of doing it in the school. So what I want you to see is liberty cannot be established through deceit or group manipulation. You cannot deceive your way to liberty. You can't dialect your way to liberty. That's not just the goal, it's the methodology. Alinsky's handbook leads to tyranny because it is a dialectic method based on relativism. And the only place that the dialectic method will lead you is to tyranny. It's the road to tyranny. You can relabel it. You can put on it, that it's the road to liberty. You can give it a fancy name. It doesn't matter what the label is. That's where it's going. So Alinsky was a master dialectician, we could say a master deceiver, who hated liberty and loved tyranny. Now, he talked about the good of the masses, and he talked about this human dignity stuff. And I just read an article recently from an author saying, oh, Alinsky was so wonderful because he talked about human dignity. But if you look at it, he's talking about it still from a standpoint of only giving people, the civil government giving people a certain amount of freedom. So he was talking about rights coming from civil government. There was no understanding of inalienable rights, even when he says, well, it's a person's right. How can an agnostic, he was born into a Jewish family, but eventually, even though he said all of his life he was Jewish, he also left, he quit practicing Judaism, and he was also a self-proclaimed agnostic. And so how can that person take you to liberty and understand the rights that you could only have through understanding a creator? How can he say these are your rights? Where's he saying that right comes from? And the way it's worded, I meet fairly well-read people who say, well, Alinsky talks about rights and human dignity, so therefore he believed in inalienable rights. Well, he maybe believed in the right of a person to make a decision for themselves, but it was still, those are the decisions that lead to death, because there's a way that seemeth right into a person, and the ends thereof are the ways of death, which is totally different from biblical liberty. Now, what's even more alarming is there is a move among conservatives to adapt Alinsky's tactics to the freedom movement. And you really need to be aware of this. While some of the methods he uses are universal, I mean, they're true, yes, they apply everywhere, the tactical application of them cannot be sanitized with the ends justifies the means. Instead of exposing the deceit at the root of Alinsky's method, we are being sucked into using the tactics of tyranny, thinking we will get liberty. And remember, it's never the deceiver's problem. It's your fault for being willing to be deceived. So again, we don't blame the deceiver for our deceit. We take responsibility for it. And People, though, don't want to do that. I mean, it's much easier to be deceived than it is to look for the truth. Now, this idea is based on the false premise that methods are neutral. In other words, why are conservatives able to buy this up is because they've accepted the false premise that methods are neutral. And a lie that has worked repeatedly, in other words, this idea that methods are neutral, is a lie that has worked repeatedly, especially in the areas of education and civil government. This is what you run into with homeschoolers now and Christian school curriculum. The content's still pretty good. The methodologies are Marxist. So you have biblical content plus Marxist method. What is that going to equal? It's going to equal a very nice Marxist. But it's not going to equal a biblical thinker, because the methodology overcomes and either enforces or negates the content. So what we're dealing with here is the idea that you can use Alinsky's methods and get liberty is a very high level deceit. Now, what's the best example of this? Well-meaning people. Freedom Works. They have a training manual out. They're very proud of it. You can download it for free from the internet. It's very well done. Rules for Patriots. It's the most obvious example of this. While well-meaning, but operating under the false premise of neutrality, some of its leaders, meaning Freedom Works leaders, openly admit to being trained community organizers who now believe they can use these tactics for good. I need to make this distinction. It's one thing to learn to speak dialectic, in other words, to study the dialectic process and NLP and all of those things, in order to understand, to guard against it. In other words, you're going to study it so you don't get caught into it. And it's another thing to learn the dialectic process, thinking you can use it for good. So you need to be aware of the dialectic. I mean, you cannot operate and function in our culture if you don't know how this works. But one of them you come at from a biblical standpoint, you know what biblical thinking is, and then everything else is counterfeit. The other way, you go and look at the world's ideas and say, which one of those can we use for the good of God? You know, how can we help Jesus out? And, of course, some of these freedom organizations are not really claiming to be Christian, that they are conservative, and they really, I think, are very well-meaning and want what they believe to be good. They raise tons of money and have a huge organization, but in the end, you have to look at what is it accomplishing and where will it lead. So many different tactics and schemes lead to tyranny. Tyranny just happens. If you let people alone and you don't teach them liberty, they will tyrannize each other just by their natural sin nature. But liberty requires conviction and understanding. So there is a language and method that leads to bondage and tyranny, and a different language and method that leads to liberty. You can reverse the way that's said. The point is those are two different pathways. Like there's a way that is broad and leads to destruction, and there's a narrow way that leads to life. It's the difference between the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in other words, mixture of good and evil, versus the tree of life. These are two different pathways. You can't mix the two. So the principles of liberty are immutable, and they include internal self-government and liberty of conscience. Now, it's taken me years to identify this, and this is a very important distinction. The internal self-government is a fruit of the Spirit. It's not discipline. It's not, I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do when I'm supposed to do it the way I'm supposed to do it, and I'm going to look down on everybody else because I can always do what I'm supposed to do when I'm supposed to do it the way I'm supposed to do it. It's not that. That's just prideful, arrogant, self-discipline, and eventually you can't be that perfect because you can't do internal self-government without the work of the Holy Spirit in your life. And then liberty of conscience. Conscience is that little voice within you that says yay or nay. Conscience is what is breached. Tyrants and slave masters breach your conscience. And it's not even the acknowledgement that you have a conscience. It's the absolute running over your conscience that is an affront to your human dignity. And see, that's why the difference between Christianity, true biblical thinking, kingdom thinking, and just religions, even those labeled Christianity, gets into liberty of conscience. Because you have to have the opportunity to say no. You have to have the right to reject in order to have the right of accepting be meaningful. Now, Saul Alinsky had 24 rules for radicals. Let's look at some of those. We're not going to go through all of them. I have another longer presentation that goes through every single one of them. But for this presentation, I'm going to spare you some. I picked out the ones that I think you've got to know now to have time to think about it. So, contrary to popular belief, Saul Alinsky did not state only 13 rules in his seminal community organizing work, Rules for Radicals. He had 24 rules. So the following list of these rules is from Subversion, Inc., How Obama's Acorn Red Shirts Are Still Terrorizing and Ripping Off American Taxpayers. This is absolutely amazing. It's from Matthew Vadum, V-A-D-U-M. WND Books stands for World Net Daily Books from 2011. It's from Appendix E, and it's quite well done. And he's just done a fabulous job and deserves all the credit for these ones. And I hope you'll be able to tell the difference between what he says and my comments, because I take part of the list and then I make a comment about it. So of Alinsky's 24 rules, 13 are rules of power tactics, and we're going to go through almost none of them. We're going to spend most of our time on the first 10 of the beginning. Now, the ones that are the numbered that are actually from Alinsky's work are in the bright blue, and then my comment after it will be in regular black. So the first point is power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Now, Alinsky, remember I told you, didn't come up with all new ideas. So this idea goes back to Sun Tzu and is part of the tactics of warfare. It's still a method of deceit, but also why the unsaved are often used by God to protect the saved. When it talks about the unsaved having more savvy with the world than the saved, it's things like this, that they may be willing to put up a whole system of deceit, where some people would feel that they could not do that. Number 2 from Alinsky, never go outside the experience of your people. So people like a leader, this is my comment, people like a leader who makes them comfortable and feels like them. In other words, they feel comfortable with them, they feel like they're one and the same, yet possesses the courage they wish they had, or they need to have the group together. In other words, they need the group to have that kind of courage. That's part of why you can get crowds to do things that you cannot get an individual to do, both good and bad. So that's why that book on the manipulation of crowds is so important, because it really explains how much easier it is to manipulate a crowd than an individual. So when the masses feel like the leader understands them, then they will emotionally follow that leader pretty much no matter where that leader takes them. Number 3, wherever possible, go outside of the experience of the enemy. Now, what does that mean? And really, there's longer explanations for all of these, so I'm just giving you a quick one. This is extremely effective because it is unsettling. It makes it harder to maintain control, especially of the motions and the subtleties of body language. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about going outside of the experience of the enemy. So, what does that mean? What's an example? Ted Cruz making matzah in New York City. Very uncomfortable. It was not that he wasn't willing to be a good sport, and he really tried, but you could still tell that he wasn't in his element. When Hillary went to Chipotle, she tried, but she had never been hardly, I mean, at least she looked like she'd never been through a fast food line like that and was absolutely clueless. You think of the traditional farmer, and of course I know a lot of farmers who would do very, very, very well at a state dinner. But the point is, you think of somebody who doesn't know, how to eat at a fancy table. That's really maybe not fair, but I grew up on a farm and I understand that caricature. But the idea of not being comfortable at a state dinner. And then, of course, one of my favorites is eating with chopsticks, because I love to eat with chopsticks. But I realize that there's lots of people who aren't comfortable with that. And so, if they're served at my table, I give them chopsticks, but I also give them other silverware. But, you look at that, and you can go on and on and on. The point is, the more comfortable you are, the more at ease, the more the masses identify. And the more uncomfortable, then they won't identify with you. They'll maybe make fun of the politician, but they won't identify. Okay, number 4, make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't live up to my own standards, so how can I expect somebody else to? So this is really done a lot, especially to anyone who claims to be religious in any manner, anyone who claims to hold to any kind of standard, and anyone who makes any claims about themselves. So this is why it's very important for you to not allow a standard to be set too high. Pastors, examples of this, pastors being held to an impossible moral standard or found in some moral compromise. Another would be economic corruption in the Office of Economic Accountability. Okay, you kind of see where this is heading. So their goal is to find some area of hypocrisy, like the woman who writes the column on weight loss for the newspaper, and they find out she weighs 400 pounds. Okay, it's that kind of thing. So that's what they're looking for. It's a way to discredit. Number 5, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. And ridicule, this is why, on one side, the stand-up comedians have so much influence. It's also why people that are the commentators and that run a lot of the opinion shows and the radio talk show host and on and on and on it goes. The people that are in positions of influence like that have at least at some time in their life been a stand-up comedian. And whether they were a good stand-up comedian or not, they learned the tricks of the trade so that they can quit back and pick up on the word patterns or on the double entendres that everybody else misses. And it gives them power over the rest of society. Alan Colmes is one of the best examples of this. He was a stand-up comedian for years and years and years before he ever broke into being a commentator and having a radio program and all of those things. And so Greg Gutfeld, a lot of those guys, that's what they did before they were in the positions they're in now. And people, it's why the sitcoms make a difference. When you have the sitcom writers reset what people consider as normal because your defenses are down when you're laughing. But also, when you're being laughed at is another way of raising the bar on culture change. So ridicule weakens us and makes us vulnerable. It changes our energy. It takes us out of control and surprises us even if we should have expected it. And we may say, oh, we're laughing with them instead of letting them laugh at us. But ridicule is a way that many people that 1 minute look like they were totally in charge and the next minute lost the room because of ridicule. Number 6, a good tactic is one that people enjoy. And leaders, this is how the mega churches, this is one of their prime uses of these tactics, is that a good tactic is one that your people enjoy. Okay, my comments. If people get hurt, lose friends or their jobs, they go away. But if they get fame and recognition, feel empowered, have fun working with the campaign, etc., they will stay. This is why they have coffee and donuts in the morning before people go knock on doors. This is why they have the free barbecue as we do in Texas, or whatever it is. This is why they have food and opportunities for people to make friendship. And it might be T-shirts and hats or something. A memorabilia from the day, some kind of recognition, a little bit of applause, the candidate coming in and speaking to the group. It's whatever it takes to make the people feel good and happy. Now, the next one has to do with timing. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. Now, these are some of the things Alinsky taught these over and over and over again, and people that are community organizers are masters at this. So, timing matters. You cannot expect too much from volunteers. There has to be an ebb and flow to their participation, or they will quit. Number 8, keep the pressure on with different tactics and actions, and utilize all events of the period for your purpose. In other words, everything that's going on around you, you figure out a way to make it further your goal. Even a newspaper article or something happens in town that wouldn't normally have any connection whatsoever, it's not related. But they figure out how to put it in the news and use it as an example of whatever they're trying to make an issue about or get a law changed about. So the paid organizers keep the pressure on, and the volunteers are used strategically. Teams focus on different aspects while the target can't fight that many fronts at once. So this is a not just this point, but a merger or a mixture of a lot of other things here that we don't have time to go into. But the idea is you keep the pressure on, and you have to have full-time people who keep the pressure on, and then the volunteer teams come and go for the different things that excites them, and you keep all of this going, and pretty soon the target, meaning the person you're trying to take down or ridicule or get to give up or change or whatever, they just can't fight that many fronts at once. Number 9, the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. Now, Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland are examples of this. Once property damage is heavy, even some of the mayors and some of the leaders said, well, we have to give them so long to get this anger worked out of them, to get this off their chest. And so they actually allowed a certain amount of property damage. Now, that didn't go over very well with the property owners, but once property damage is heavy, elected officials are more likely to cave than have a repeat. So the community organizers come back and threaten, we'll do that again if you don't give us what we want. Now, these cities are also examples of why your local sheriff must understand Alinsky's rules and have a plan ahead. He should not be broadsided, surprised, or without an advanced plan with contingencies. He will not have time to respond wisely and will be made a fool in the media by the community organizers for whom this is not their first rodeo. In other words, they are using proven practice methods. They go around the country. The same folks go around the country and lead the locals in how to do riots and how to create chaos and how to create disruption and all of these things. So when they come to a new community, it's new to the community. It's new to the local sheriff. It's new to the mayor and the city council. But the people running the show, they could tell you what everybody's going to do tomorrow because they've studied this ahead. So if you're going to have wise leadership, you need to have especially your local sheriff, male or female, who knows about these things and is ready to go. Okay, number 13. See, as you can see, we're skipping now because we've got to keep moving. So this one you see every day in the news. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. This is when they make fun of the mayor, fun of the sheriff, when they pick a victim, and the story becomes all about the victim, not about justice for the person who's living, but for supposedly justice for the person who died. Now, I understand the problem with that, and I'm not saying that you ever justify evil. Okay, evil is evil. But see, what do we have going on? When you call evil evil, evil is evil. But when you mix all these things together and have all this dialectic doublespeak, people get confused and they lose track of what are we about. So this is why specific situations make for bad laws. They get the people thinking about the pain, sorrow, or problem that the individual they know has faced. So they try to write a law to solve the problem, often forgetting about principal or long-term consequences for others. This is just a basic premise that you don't want a law written in response to one particular action. That's how you get piles of laws that just take away the essential liberties of all the people. So putting a face on the problem is important for the community organizer because that face becomes an emotional bond that disengages the rational, objective thoughts of the audience or the lawmakers and moves them to an irrational, relativistic frame. Now, the remaining 11 rules of Alinsky that Alinsky describes are concerned with the ethics of means and ends, and we just don't have time to go through very many of them. So we're going to go to number 3, and that says, in war, the end justifies almost any means. I've mentioned this before, but I really want you to see this is one of his running themes. And this is why the dialectic process, with its unquestioned belief in relativism, must be widely accepted for tyranny to take hold. See, once this light bulb goes off in your head, why do I study this dialectic? Because of the consequences, then it makes the application much easier. This section of 11 tactics uses moral and ethical terms as a means of breaking down the morals and ethics of the participants. Now, a lot of you need to go back and listen to that part again, because it's like when somebody writes a book about virtue, then people will think that they have virtue. When somebody writes a book about whatever, then the book can often be done like a book about moral and ethics that's to break down the moral and ethics of the culture. Then people will think that it's written by someone who wants to maintain morals and ethics. Number 11 in this list, in the second part, this is from Alinsky, goals must be phrased. Goals must be phrased in general terms like liberty, equality, fraternity. You heard that one before? Of the common welfare, pursuit of happiness, or bread and peace. That's just a few. So, this is another quote. A Marxist begins with his prime truth that all evils are caused by the exploitation of the proletariat by the capitalist. From this, he logically proceeds to the revolution to end capitalism, and then into the third stage of reorganization into a new social order of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And finally, the last stage, the political paradise of communism. Now, that's again from the Matthew Vadum article that is on the screen right now. Now, let's keep moving. Next quotes are going to have a term in it called open society. I'm telling you before we talk about Alinsky using the term open society, I want you to know that the term open society is a George Soros goal. And it's the subject of most of his books. He actually has a book that has that in the title. His organizations have that in the title, and you will hear it in TED Talks and all over the place of people some of whom I think understand what an open society means and some of whom don't. So I want you to understand that what's the definition? This is my very quick summary of the concept of open society. It means no borders, no boundaries, no fixed standards of right and wrong. Okay, so an open society, there's no fixed anything. So this is the quote. An organizer working in and for an open society is in an ideological dilemma to begin with. He does not have a fixed truth. Truth to him is relative and changing. Everything to him is relative and changing. To the extent that he is free from the shackles of dogma in other words, 6 beliefs, he can respond to the realities of the widely different situations. In other words, situational ethics. Now, even if you don't get all of this, the point I want you to see is this is why Benjamin Bloom was so important in Alinsky's methods being received, because Benjamin Bloom says on page 6 of his book that his premise is that there are no fixed beliefs, that everything is relative. So this all starts to fit together, and things that look like isolated, standalone situations and circumstances are really, there's a cause and effect relationship between them. So Alinsky's tactics were based not on Stalin's revolutionary violence, but on the neo-Marxist strategies of Antonio Gramsci, an Italian communist. In other words, we talked about other times about the difference between traditional Marxists who use bullets and guns and blood, maybe bloody, and a transformational Marxist that uses ideas and language and words. So what Alinsky was about, even though there's sometimes they take action, is that most of their change is through using group manipulation techniques and social engineering. So relying on gradualism, infiltration, and the dialectic process, rather than a bloody revolution, Gramsci's transformational Marxism was so subtle that few even noticed the deliberate changes. So they were change agents, and if you remember the presentations about that, the change agents makes the change without the person who's being changed even though they're being changed. So like Alinsky, Mikhail Gorbachev followed Gramsci, not Lenin. In fact, Gramsci aroused Stalin's wrath by suggesting that Lenin's revolutionary plan wouldn't work in the West. Instead, the primary assault would be on biblical absolutes and Christian values. Just let that sink in a second. The primary assault would be on biblical absolutes and Christian values. And what are those Christian values? I'm going to insert this like a parenthesis. Patriarchal, fatherhead, strong families, individual self-government, character, all of those things. That's where the assault would be. Morals. Okay, so let's go on. Which must be crushed as a social force before the new face of communism, probably relabeled into some New World Order term, could rise and flourish. Maybe it would be labeled something under Agenda 21. It's going to have a beautiful face. It's going to sound so wonderful that even strong Christians will be deceived. True revolutionaries do not flaunt their radicalism. They cut their hair, put on suits, and infiltrate the system from within. And that's part of how you see many of the former radicals. They went and cut their hair, and they started teaching and infiltrating places, getting elected to office, and looking very mainstream. Now, Alinsky died in 1972, but his legacy lives on as a staple of leftist method, a blueprint for revolution, which he and his disciples euphemistically referred to as change. Folks, don't tell me that the term change doesn't have a definition. It has a definition spelled out in Alinsky, but people don't realize, they don't take the time to study. So you can find out more about this, especially in the book Mountains of Deceit. When you start to realize what's going on and for how many years I've taught on these different things, you will start to see. Now, you need Mountains of Deceit first. You need to read the book over and over and over again. I go back every once in a while and I go, wow, Lord, I can't believe how good you did in putting that in the book, because I didn't even remember that was there. And then when you look at the 5 Pillars of Liberty, you'll see the standard that will protect you from being sucked into unbiblical methodology. And when you look at the Declaration of Dependence, you will see how to pray for the nation, and you start to study about idolatry, because Alinsky is wanting you to replace God with civil government. and with yourself as your own God. So this book prays against that. And then the 31 Plus book, that really deals with the mindset that would change that mindset of poverty, and people have to be poor and vulnerable in order to be vulnerable to tyrants. So let's go ahead and open it up to Q&A. I know I've gone some past here, but I just want to bless you and thank you. And so let's, right now, the questions need to stay on topic from anything we've talked about with Alinsky.
All right, the lines are open. Feel free to ask questions or type them in the chat box.
Hey, Marlene, this is Ann. Hi.
Great. Hi, glad you're on.
Hi, thank you. Hey, yeah, I have had this feeling. I didn't know a lot about Saul Alinsky, but I kept getting this Alinsky feeling. I kept getting this idea that Donald Trump's, his methods are Alinsky methods, although I didn't believe he was an Alinskyite. And except for the Marxist aspect of it, he uses all of this. I mean, it's like he's the embodiment of this. I mean, like he does the in your face, the manipulation, the repeated lies and ridicule, running over your conscience. The truth is always changing, all of that stuff. So I wanted to see what you thought about that. I mean, I just took copious notes here. This sparked a lot of thought in me because, there's so many different angles, that you can recognize it's happening.
Well, what I think we need to look at is that the very concept of a conservative liberal, left, right, rich, poor, any kind of pitting against two sides is in itself a Marxist model. So while the two sides are fighting each other, they're like making an arch, and in the middle of the arch, they're leaving an open hole for the tyrant to flow through. The other point I want to make is that when you look at both parties, you have the one world government goals of both parties, and if you study Alinsky's methods, he basically says, make it look like you're different when you're really not. Now, where you would have to go, though, into analyzing a little more with the candidates has to do with who's speaking and an is and not language and still believes in a patriarchal standard, even if it is more like a benevolent dictator patriarchal standard, like the populist, versus the person who doesn't even believe in borders. And whether you like Trump or not, part of the response of the people is that they want somebody who will give them borders. So okay. So
there is that thing, and that's another lie because he's gone back on it. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing when you were saying that, because you were talking about doing different things, and he went out and ate that taco bowl on Cinco de Mayo, and all of those things. Really, the ridicule and making other people abide by their rules while you go outside the rules, and so it just kind of makes them bulletproof, and other people don't want to stoop that low, so they're kind of helpless against his tactic.
And see, my deal is, if I'm going to have anybody using the dialectic, I'd rather they did not use it in the name of Jesus. So I respond very badly, whether it's a mega church or a Christian candidate who by their own admission are saved. Okay, I'm not judging their salvation. I'm saying they say they are. Okay, so taking them at their word, it bothers me more for them to use the dialectic methods of deceit in the name of Christ. And I'm less bothered. I'm not saying I'm not, but I'm less bothered when it's not done in the name of Jesus.
Oh, okay, and that leads me to another thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I've noticed that the Tea Party seems to be co-opted, and you were talking about the Freedom Works people using, rules for patriots that they've adapted from rules for radicals. And I was looking that up on the internet while you were talking, and the first description, one of the first descriptions I saw was that they have been an instrumental force in the Tea Party, the Freedom Works.
Oh, very. Okay, now, let me address that, because I'm even speaking for a Tea Party in the Dallas area tomorrow. And for those of you with the tape, you won't have a chance to see that, but there are some things even from other places that I've spoken that deal with basically the idea of how come we spent millions of dollars, have all of this work in the Save the Country organizations, but the country's worse off than it was before. And it gets into the idea of, are our premises right? Whenever you got a problem, a bad result, you have to go back and look at, what are my operating premises and do they need to change? So when the Tea Party came along, it was what could be called as more of a secular Great Awakening. In other words, it wasn't necessarily, some of it was, would be more of a spiritual answer to prayer, and some of it was just people were plain fed up. Either way, God can use that. But then what has to happen, the elitists have to squelch that, or they have to co-opt it. Co-opt meaning, and Ann knows the meaning of this, but I want for everybody else too to be sure that means kind of drawn in and sucked in back into, in the Tea Party case, back to being good little Republicans and not rocking the boat in the Republican Party. And so, and certainly don't go form a third party. So the point we're getting at here is a lot of the leaders of the Tea Party, first of all, were community organizers themselves. So they're very good at getting a crowd. They're very good at promotion, but they're not necessarily absolute thinkers, and most of them are certainly not biblical thinkers. So it's like I spoke to somebody here recently, and I explained to him, where's my distinction? Like with Common Core, I could make materials about what's bad about Common Core, but I have materials about what's unbiblical about Common Core. So what I'm providing for my listeners is I'm going to take you, there was very little scripture in what we did tonight, but if you listen to my overall presentation, sometimes they're almost all scripture, and I'm going to take you to get a biblical worldview that sees the real and sees everything else as a counterfeit. So anyway, Ann, you have so much to offer here, because you really are, thinking on a higher plane and have a good vocabulary and understanding. So
you were my teacher.
Well, I love what you're bringing up, and these are very real things. And the other point I think we need to make is, see, we don't trust in a president to solve our problems. And when we reduce our national problem to a political problem, that means we would want a political solution. Yes, God can use politics, but our problems are spiritual problems in need of a spiritual solution, and then they have a practical outgrowth, a practical manifestation in how it works out. So my point is, we need to take these things to the courts of heaven, win the battle in the courts of heaven, and then go work on earth to see to do our part to bring it forward, but we're never trusting in our own strength. We're just being obedient to what we're called to do, to make it manifest.
Amen.
Okay, so those are totally different things.
Yes.
So anyway, so thank you for all that. Do we have anybody else that has a question or comment?
Yes, Grace is asking, or first the comment, then her question. Okay, I have heard that U.S. presidents have been pre-selected for 4 decades and that they are all from interwoven bloodlines and secret societies, and that the elections are part of the ploy to make us believe we are choosing when really we are being led like sheep along their prescribed path to their tyranny. Is this grounded in any truth, and is it a part of the Alinsky tactics?
Okay, what a great question. I recently was a delegate to the state Republican convention in Texas, and there were some people that had a booth actually talking about how elections are rigged and how a lot of these things work, and I couldn't believe they were allowed. They're just precious as they can be, and maybe even some of them are on tonight. But, the point is they really got into even that part, just the election, how the vote can be manipulated. So then what else you get into is how do you become a presidential candidate? And by the time somebody even becomes a presidential candidate, there's a whole lot of other things that have happened behind the scenes. So some of this you have to look at and go, wow, there's a lot of proof on these things. Other things there may not be. But I still come back to that blessed is the nation whose God is Yahweh. That God turns the heart of the king. And one of the principles of government is that the people get the form of leader that they deserve, or get the leader that they deserve. And we actually years ago in one of our first study groups, we had the basic study group, and then we had the advanced study group. And it was like the second year of study group where the people that had been in the year before, we were going to go do something different. We eventually figured out how to make it more like a one-room schoolhouse, and everybody could stay together, and the people that were new could get the beginning stuff, and then they heard it the next year, and it became more advanced and more advanced. But my point is, one of the brilliant men that came, he decided to try to prove that people didn't get the form of government they deserved. And eventually, it came out that, yes, they really do, both biblically and historically. So I used to get really concerned about what I can't change. And I'd like to say it never hits me, but now sometimes it does. But what I'm seeing is the awakening of the people. You read even Psalms with David crying out to God to come and deliver him from the oppressor. And you read about tyranny. I mean, all of Psalms, or a lot of Psalms, is about the healing of the soul, the healing of the brokenhearted, and tyranny, liberty, slavery, delivering me from my enemies, all of those things. And where does he go to? He goes to God. So no matter how much power the people that think they're in power have, no matter how much money the people that think they run the economic system of the world have, there is a King of kings and Lord of lords, very God of very gods. And those of us who know him need to spend more time talking directly with him and not worrying about these other things. I mean, what can these mere men do to us? And I'm talking to you as somebody who's been poisoned for what I believe. So I'm not here lightly saying this, folks, okay? I mean, I have an interest in this. I've dedicated my life to this. But when I look at it, I have to come back to who you fear or what you fear determines greatly what happens in your life. And the people that want us to fear them, they don't fear God, but they do fear people who don't fear them. And so you have to come back and say, I fear Yahweh. I care about him, and I serve him, and I trust him. And I really believe that we have the opportunity for a great awakening in this country to where the tyrants will at least have their power diminished. But where did those tyrants get in power? Because of a false theology that said that the world belongs to Satan. And instead of the theology that says that it's our duty to take dominion not over the people but over the earth, and that it's our responsibility to understand the kingdom and individual self-government. It reframes the issue. And part of what is where we're sucked in to the whole party conflict and
okay, Dr. Marlene, it's part of where we're sucked in, and then we had a bunch of static. Would you repeat, please?
Okay, thank you. So where we're sucked into their frame of reference, and what we have to do is, if we're going to have a kingdom mindset, is we have to raise the bar of our thinking. And when you look at the kingdom is within, and that we're called to have individual self-government. So my job is not to try to build up an earthly king like the disciples wanted Jesus to do. But my job is to allow the kingdom of God within me to govern me. And from that position of sitting at the right hand of the Father, of understanding the courts of heaven, from that position of that we labor not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, and knowing that greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. When I reframe my mindset into that, then I have all I can do to learn how to govern myself. And in that process of self-government, I can take dominion around me, and it will change my world without having to worry about what choices other people make. It's very empowering, and you will find the level of liberty. So you have to be set free yourself before you can set other people free. So that's where our battle is that we need to learn how to be set free ourselves. Your question is fantastic, and it really could be a beginning of a whole teaching sometime, that I'd love to have that dialogue even with you, where we do an open line and we do kind of what Ann and I were just doing, only do it for the whole time, and have several of you, as long as I know ahead you're going to be on, then I would consider picking a date and saying we'll do an open line and we'll talk about some of those things more. Okay, anything else in the Q&A? Or any comments back
yes,
that they have?
Yes, we do. We're out of time, but we do have one more. And Robin and Jeff are saying, is Islam being allied with Alinsky forces to contrast opposites, to bring conflict, to make an open society, etc.?
Oh, what a great question. And the answer is yes and yes and yes. And if you read that Political Spirit book, it really explains it. Also, in William Federer's book, his book about what every Christian needs to know about the Quran, I think is where it is, but it's in some of, Bill Federer talks about that some. And when you look at why would, like, liberal women, like the people on The View, on the majority, why would they not have a problem with Islam that makes a woman wear a burqa or cover, whatever? And why would they not speak against that? And yet a man who wants his wife to stay home and take care of the children is considered some kind of an evil tyrant. So then you have to come back. It's because they're operating, the political spirit and the religious spirit are operating under the same spirit, and it's a spirit of tyranny and not a spirit of liberty. So they team up against liberty. Okay, Jackie, anything else?
That's it. And
okay, then we have some announcements afterwards, so just stay on for a minute and let her take care of going off the recording.
All right. This concludes the recording. Blessings.